gives me great pleasure to introduce Jason Parker to you. Jason taught for several years at the University of West Virginia before moving on to Texas A&M, where he is now an associate professor. His first book dealt with the process of decolonization in the British West Indies. It dealt with issues of race and empire, nationalism in the Cold War in a very imaginative way, and it won the prestigious Stuart Bernath Award from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations as the outstanding first book by a scholar written in the year that it was published. He's going to speak to us today about his second book project, which will be published by Oxford University Press, which also published his first book. The second book will appear sometime this summer. He's just finished the final stages of editing and revising that book, and it's now in the hands of his publisher. Jason, as some of you may remember, was a postdoctoral fellow here at the Mershon Center in the 2006-2007 academic year, and that is when he first began working on this book. So it really is an opportunity for him to come full circle with this research project and to share with us today an overview of what he seeks to do in this soon-to-be out book. So without further ado, Jason Parker.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thanks to the Mershon for having me back. It wasn't until Bob was speaking just now that I realized that coming back here to present what I'm going to present you today represents kind of bookends for the book's end, because I did it at the beginning of the process, and now here we are at the final stages. I'm superstitious enough not to believe the book's actually going to be published until I see it in front of me on the table. But Bob's right that this summer it should be out with Oxford, and I'm very excited for that. But I want to stress that it owes a great debt to the Mershon Center. The year that I had here as a postdoc helped me to think through some of the issues in what was at the time, although I barely detected it, a growing project. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the formal remarks, but it is an evolution, a sort of intellectual evolution for the project that I give the Mershon Center a great deal of credit for, because I don't think if I hadn't been in this room having conversations with the other postdoc fellows, it was a marvelous year intellectually, I don't think that it would have come off it wouldn't have grown into what it became. I'm going to pause there for a second to see. I can't tell if I'm doing this right, just as a technical matter. It's on? Yep. Can you tell me if, can we see? All right, just making sure. So thank you to Bob, to Rick, to everyone for coming, and Ms. Ron for having me. I don't get to say this much when I'm giving talks, but happy leap year, because I think this is my first ever talk on this day. And a final note of praise to the Mershon Center, just to sort of underline the intellectual community that I recall from my years here. It extended not just to challenging, really, what was at the process a very embryonic idea for a book, but also a level of collegiality that I think is best captured in the fact that while I was here, carrying my PhD from the University of Florida, that was the year, for those of you who have been around long enough, that Florida destroyed Ohio State in the championship game. And I actually had a Gators poster on my office door upstairs. And no one ever said a crossword to me. So I give the Mershon Center and Rick, its leadership, great credit for establishing that kind of vibe. So my presentation today, is going to involve an overview of the book as well as a couple sort of particular, more granular case studies within it, in the service of not just what it started out as, but what the book became. And if anyone has any brilliant ideas about how to improve it and or sees any giant red flags, production starts pretty soon, so this is your chance to save me from printing something stupid, and I am grateful for your help. I did wrestle, and this is tied into its conceptual evolution, with the title of the book, which is the same as the title of the presentation today, Hearts, Minds, Voices, Cold War Public Diplomacy and the Formation of the Third World. The original conception of the book was somewhat smaller in scope and in ambition, and it was called simply The Contest. The idea was I was going to reconstruct the history of American outreach, winning hearts and minds, in the Global South, in the Third World. The Seinfeldian overtones of the contest forced me to change that title. I went to Hearts, Minds, Voices because of the way that the book's thesis evolved. As I delved further and further into the archives, as well as the secondary literature, which itself was experiencing a kind of a flourish regarding international history and the global history of the Cold War, it became clear to me that my conceptualization of the topic was inadequate, and that rebuilding the story, reconstructing the story of U.S. public diplomacy as sent out to the Third World really missed an important part of the story. Most of all, it missed the part of the story that took Third World as a historical construct and tried to get deeper into its own process of evolution, to historicize the idea of the Third World as a sort of geopolitical concept and an entity. So the books I mentioned in global Cold War history, above all, Arnie Westad, Vijay Prashad, Erez Manella, Nicholas Cole, Jeffrey Byrne, there's a number of works that repositioned our sort of orientation regarding the Cold War in the Global South, and the need to historicize the term Third World itself was what drove me toward the more evolved thesis, namely that Cold War public diplomacy, number one, was not only practiced by the North on the South, and the South's response to it was an important formative part of the process of the entity, of the imagined community, if I can borrow that from Benedict Anderson, of the Third World. The outreach, the attempt to win hearts and minds in the South elicited instead their voices and created a much broader global conversation that shifted the Cold War from being this sort of bipolar confrontation to a very multipolar engagement borne along sort of media streams from points north and south alike. So my central contention is that public diplomacy practiced by the North, but not only by the North, helped to engender the Third World as a concept, as an imagined community. If I can jump us forward a little bit here. One way to think about it, let's see, sorry, my PowerPoint skills are not strong. There we go. Is to engage the way that these two post-war processes of decolonization and Cold War helped to draw two different sets of lines on the map. The map in the upper left is the map of the empires as of 1945. The map on the lower right are the three worlds of the Cold War, First World, Second World, Third World. And the process of those two things was concurrent, but not always and in every place equally mutually influential, even if they did in the end give us the atlas that we know. So the story is of one very large unintended consequence to unfold on the post-war global stage, how an American strategic problem, the winning of hearts and minds, made a new map of the world, and not the one that the United States thought that it was making. The book uses a range of case studies in public diplomacy, in media outreach to the Global South, to trace three major constituent themes that were essential to the constituting of the Third World as they emerged and fused into that entity. Neutralism comes non-alignment is one of the three. Another is tougher to sort of encapsulate, but I usually call it the spirit of Bandung, or the sort of anti-colonial racial solidarity of the non-white Global South. And finally, the theme of underdevelopment and poverty, leading to the need for economic development and modernization. So the idea that these are three potential glues, these are three themes that join together otherwise disparate parts of the post-imperial world, including, at their fullest extent, even the long decolonized regions of Latin America. So what I want to do is to lay out some of the vignettes from the case studies, having now sort of drawn this big picture of the big book. And I selected the ones I did because they're chronologically coherent. They all take place in the late 50s, early 60s, and they're going to pull out some of these broader themes, these three big themes that help to sketch the bigger picture of the Third World. After that, I'll circle back to the public diplomacy literature to suggest that one sort of extra benefit of the project is not just re-perceiving the post-war as this sort of global phenomenon, the Cold War as this global phenomenon, but also, I hope, helping to settle a long-standing problem, a long-standing question in the literature on public diplomacy. Our case studies we'll come back to in a minute. The Belgrade Conference in 1961, founding the Non-Aligned Movement, the Congo Crisis and the Year of Africa, 1960, and finally the Alliance for Progress. In each case, I will be speaking less about the event or the item itself and more about the public diplomacy surrounding it, as the sort of after effects that come from having and forcing these conversations on these topics. By way of sort of setting the table, to define our terms, public diplomacy and third world, public diplomacy is conventionally defined as the attempt to shape foreign opinion in ways that are beneficial to a nation's strategic interests. So the idea is if you can persuade them you're on the side of the right, they can put pressure on their leaders to help their leaders, to our countries, make policies that are more favorable to your ultimate strategic objectives. It's worth noting that this is not always foreign mass opinion. In many cases, it has to do with the niches of particular societies, especially emerging nations, whether it's the leadership cadre or the teachers or the unions or the students or what have you. Public diplomacy can cover many fronts. Two, it's worth noting that although the term can be found in diplomatic documents going back to the Revolution, the American Revolution, it only has its sort of modern shape after 1965, at which point it is the successor to a long and I think very telling series of labels that get applied to the idea of trying to win hearts and minds. The documents through the 40s, 50s, and 60s refer to propaganda, political warfare, psychological warfare, most benignly, most commonly, information operations, and they encompass a variety of means and of media. Cultural diplomacy is a well-known sort of subset of this, involving person-to-person exchanges, the tours of people like Louis Armstrong to try to win over foreign populations. Gray and black stripes of propaganda, which is usually done by covert operatives, not by the USIA, but which involves unattributed sort of news stories planted at particular times in particular foreign venues. Large-scale communications media like the Voice of America, film and print distribution, and niche outreach targeted at those teachers, at those unions, at those students, in order to hopefully win allies in the influential sectors of these foreign societies. Most of these operations are consolidated under the USIA's umbrella when that agency is founded in 1953. Now, for both practitioners and historians, both then and now, both the practice and the study of public diplomacy brings with it a permanent problem and a permanent question. The permanent problem, what we might call the word-deed gap, is the difference between policy and the spin about that policy. Like, you can only sell a message so far if it seems starkly at odds with the actual policies that you're trying to promote. So the most obvious example of this during the period in question would be the need to explain Jim Crow violence in the South, in the so-called land of the free and home of the brave, to non-white audiences abroad. It's a tough sell because for every time you try to say, as the USIA, that we're making good progress, we believe in equality, we believe in equal rights, the newsreels show the footage of the mobs in Little Rock or in Birmingham or where have you. So you can only go so far before you confront the word-deed gap, and that's something that bedevils public diplomacy by all parties at pretty much all times. The permanent problem then is that gap, but the permanent question is it working? It's virtually impossible to find a fail-safe metric for telling whether or not your outreach is actually having anything resembling the effect you desire. Now, by the time of the period we're going to discuss today, late 50s, early 60s, the USIA's tools for this, for audience research, for market research, had gotten better than they had been at pretty much any time prior. But even that didn't give them the kind of conclusiveness that you would have liked to have before you spent all this money trying to win hearts and minds. Edward R. Murrow, when he was director of the USIA in the early 60s during these years, put it this way: no cash register rings when a man changes his mind. It's easy enough to figure out whether or not a movie is popular overseas or Coca-Cola is popular overseas because money changes hands. Those things get sold, the tickets, the bottles, the burgers, whatever. Not the case when you're trying to sell ideas, when you're trying to convert to your persuasion. In defense of Murrow's USIA and his predecessors, for that matter successors, during these years, public opinion polling itself is a fairly inexact science. Everyone's familiar with the famous Dewey defeats Truman newspaper headline. That's not long before these years, and that was with a domestic audience. Think how much more difficult it is to an audience that is not just actually foreign, but also sort of figuratively foreign to the experience of American officials, charged with figuring out whether or not the American message is resonating. Those audiences constitute what we have stopped calling the third world, but at the time that's sort of the term of art. And it's worth exploring as well as public diplomacy and defining our terms, because it's a term that we sort of all think we know what we mean by it. It is, though, in its time, contested, and it takes a while for that contestation to settle on a rough consensus, both North and South, in global Cold War discourse. When the term was first coined in 1952 in French, it didn't include Latin America, for example. Its original conception had to do with the decolonizing world. A French demographer, Alfred Sauvy, used the term, which he knew would resonate with a French audience, because tiers-monde, as he uses it, is meant to call forth the tiers-état of the French Revolution. So the idea is that just as in 1789, the peasants are revolting to claim their destiny, the tiers-mondes are the 20th century's peasants. They're the ones who are rising up to change the established order. But the term remains more popular in French than English for most of the 50s, and it's not until 1961 when Jean-Paul Sartre writes an introduction to Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, which is then translated into English, that the term begins to have some purchase in American and British conversations. As with public diplomacy, during these same years, there are a number of sort of candidate labels that are advanced to describe the rough grouping of the Global South, since you're trying to figure out which of these elements have the most play, which of the ones are the best glue to sort of bind them together. So among the candidates, which did or didn't take for various years during the 1950s, the underdeveloped or less developed nations, the Bandung nations, sticks for a while, the Afro-Asian or the Afro-Arab Asian nations, the uncommitted, the neutrals, the non-aligned, and each of these labels is correct as far as it goes, but none of them have the kind of comprehensiveness that Third World finally does when that term is claimed and reclaimed by Global South actors themselves, as Vijay Prashad's Third World Project begins to coalesce in these years. So the USIA created in 1953 to consolidate the various World War II agencies and various forms of outreach the government had undertaken since the Cold War had begun, was getting a bit of a late start. As early as 1945, U.S. diplomats in the Middle East reported that there were Soviet broadcasts in Arabic in that region, while there was virtually nothing in kind from the American side to places that were on the cusp of great and revolutionary changes. When American public diplomacy finally got up and running, its initial instinct, as with much of the Cold War, was to aim at Europe. But in the 1950s, precisely because decolonization was beginning to roil and change the global map, attention turned fairly quickly to the Global South. That shift away from Europe and the East Bloc is never comprehensive. It's not like you leave behind Europe or the East Bloc, but you do have a shift in focus during the 1950s to the Global South, which reached a kind of an apex in the early 1960s. So, to the case studies, and as noted, these are chronologically sort of coherent around the term 1960. That's also convenient for me because the two presidents in question, Eisenhower and Kennedy, are the truest believers of all the post-war presidents in the exercise of public diplomacy. It's also, for those who like the show Mad Men, sort of the height of that era of the idea that you could shape opinion, that you could sell things, whether it was a message about your country or a brand of shaving cream, via the clever use of mass media. So it's in these years the U.S. achieves new theaters and new levels of not just audience research sophistication, but also sort of deployment of message sophistication. And, as we'll see, faced in these same years new levels of competition, which I think is the most important part of the story. So our first case study, the Belgrade Conference of September 1961, founding the non-aligned movement, signaled that non-alignment, now sort of evolved from the term neutralism, which its original incarnation, had become, in the words of one policy planning staff official, quote, a fact of national and international life to which the West must adjust. Belgrade posed a very delicate PR challenge for the new administration because there are elements of each of these third world sort of constitutive themes and an uneasy relationship between the United States and arguably each of them. Prompted in part by the Congo crisis, which we'll come back to, the Belgrade organizers, Nasser, Tito, and Nehru, there in the upper left, seen in the more comprehensive picture in the lower right with Kwame Nkrumah and Sukarno also in frame. Each of the organizers had his own sort of domestic and regional reasons for championing non-alignment. Each could plausibly be said to represent their country, perhaps their region's interest and stake in the same. Now, these differed in national and regional particulars, but there was enough common ground that you could build a transnational persuasion upon it, which was what they sought to do at Belgrade. The Kennedy administration debated how to approach the prospective meeting since, as with Bandung a few years earlier, the Americans weren't invited. As historian Rob Rakove shows, there was broad internal agreement within the Kennedy administration on the importance of the non-aligned nations and of the need for good relations with them. But the Kennedy approach was an unspoken strategy of divide and conquer by establishing good bilateral relations with each of the individual leaders and countries in question. So that doesn't answer how you deal with a collective moment like Belgrade. A mere month before the meeting, Kennedy aide Arthur Schlesinger surmised that the Soviets were, quote, undoubtedly as uncertain as we are as to what might come out of this bag of eels. Anti-colonialism will be the unifying emotion, and there is not much we can do about that. The Kennedy administration settled on a public diplomacy strategy of hands-off. The thought was that the more you make yourself an issue, make yourself a presence, the less likely it's going to redound to your benefit. And so, for the run-up to the conference itself, the idea was we're going to stay out of it as much as possible. We will rely on American journalists who will be on site, and we'll rely on Ambassador George F. Kennan, who is just taking up residence in Yugoslavia, and will help to shape the narrative to the extent he is involved in the conversation. But the timing of it works against this strategy, because the summer of 1961 is one of those Cold War moments where, above all in Berlin, crises tend to run away from their sort of starting points and threaten to overturn the best laid plans. It's interesting, too, regarding Berlin, as a quick side note, the USIA's output on the Berlin crisis that led to the construction of the Berlin Wall in August 1961, their output in the Global South framed Berlin as a contest of self-determination. The thought is that this is what's going to hit a chord in Africa and Asia and other places who otherwise feel very distant from the Cold War. It didn't actually work, but it's instructive, I think, and sort of speaks to their mindset regarding the kinds of messages they think are going to register. The cresting of the Berlin crisis and the failure of the self-determination trope to actually get much purchase in the Global South led the administration to reconsider. A presidential message emphasizing historic American anti-colonialism and support for the UN, by the way, two perennials in USIA programming for the Global South from the very beginning, even its predecessors, always foregrounded those things, which was, as far as the USIA could tell afterward, appreciated by the governments on site in Belgrade. A gesture that was helped by a Soviet own goal right on the eve of the conference. As it began, Khrushchev announced that the Soviets would resume nuclear testing, and all of the parties in presence, their home country media, and Nkrumah's, Nasser's, Nehru's, had a field day with this and helped the Kennedy message of sort of bland support for the general agenda to have someone more purchased than it otherwise might have had. As Kennan reported from on site during the conference, quote, there appears an increasing likelihood that on several important issues, the sense of the conference will be less damaging to U.S. interests than the more pessimistic forecasts anticipated. In the aftermath, a resumption of the hands-off policy, where the less said the better, seemed to pay off as the USIA's field agents tracked the press in participating nations, most of which found Belgrade to be a kind of a triumph, with their own actors on site to be the main forces in that triumph. They found, too, fairly universal agreement on the Soviet own goal, that this was a terrible misfire by Khrushchev, and found that the U.S. image had not taken a hit. But the divisions within the Belgrade grouping, which are now rechristened the non-aligned movement, or NAM, continued to confuse and worry the U.S., as did the conference's continued elevation of anti-colonialism over Cold War issues. This was something that American officials had real trouble grasping as an intellectual matter. How could that be more important than the things we esteem to be the most important parts of the Cold War? As Rakove writes, Nehru's speech at Belgrade emphasized, quote, war and peace over colonialism and poverty, and thus proved most satisfying to U.S. observers. But he was nearly alone in this emphasis, which was drowned in a torrent of anti-colonial rhetoric from the other attendees. This forms a nice segue into Congo and Africa, because if anti-colonialism is what's actually driving a movement whose origins are rooted in a refusal to participate in the Cold War on the terms that the Global North wants to impose, you have essentially a competing base of allegiance, a competing persuasion that might actually reshape the Global South's map in ways that non-alignment couldn't even do. If the founding of its movement at Belgrade meant, again, Rakov, that non-alignment was a more inclusive uniting principle than Afro-Asian identity, it was nonetheless far from certain at the time that it would eclipse the competition. Not just that non-alignment could eclipse race-infused identity, but it could also eclipse the need for addressing poverty and underdevelopment through economic development and modernization. Race and anti-colonialism clearly preoccupied the Belgrade parties as much or more as Cold War or non-alignment issues did. Contemporary U.S. observers said the same. Robert S. Brown, African-American who traveled in the service of as an ambassador attaché, quote, "The tremendous block of newly independent and neutral or uncommitted nations are primarily concerned about one issue, the assertion of the equality of the white and the non-white races. In comparison with this objective, all other issues, such as communism, space travel, economic development, even the Third World War, shrink to insignificance." So non-alignment could, in theory, appeal to anyone, but it could be eclipsed just as easily by the impassioned calls to racial and anti-colonial solidarity built into either of the pans within the constituent regions, Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism, or beyond them across Vijay Prasad's darker nations in the Third World Project. In what comes to be called the spirit of Bandung, here shots taken from the April 1955 conference at Bandung, Indonesia, you have a kind of destiny captured at the moment by writers like Richard Wright, who attended the conference and came back and wrote a book in the United States called The Color Curtain, avowing once again that race and anti-colonialism are the issues dividing humanity, not the Iron Curtain and its attendant sort of Cold War dramas. So this doesn't indicate dissent from non-alignments. The avatars of non-alignment, like Kwame Nkrumah, could speak of what they called positive neutralism as the necessary and indeed, in that case, distinctly African stance for new independent nations. But the USI found consistently that Africans, not just the masses, but elites as well, ranked race and anti-colonialism higher priority over time. To quote from one report in 1961, Africans felt themselves removed from the Cold War and thus tried to insulate Africa from its effects by remaining non-aligned. Reacting to external issues in terms of parochial interests, their declarations were colored by an intense bias against Western colonialism and imperialism, which they saw in such issues as Cuba, Congo, and Angola. Now, it's important to note that such sentiment predated the Cold War by decades. And if inchoate and uncontested, the will to African solidarity and the sense of an African or a racialized destiny were nonetheless quite powerful. The USI found repeatedly that these visions persisted, and these dynamics were a staple of public diplomacy by almost all parties. Japan, for example, in its outreach to its neighbors in Asia, stressed what it called the racial kinship of the Asian nations. Chinese outreach in Latin America highlighted that, quote, "The American republics and the people's democracy share colored skin." Perhaps even more tellingly, USI reports elsewhere found that, quote, "Peking argued in Africa that its own example of revolution was more relevant than that of the far more mature and essentially European Soviet Union. The Chinese stressed their former colonial status and their non-white and non-European origins and their common problems with Africa." Moreover, they were pushing this message at a time when African appetites for media were growing by leaps and bounds. The growth coincides with the Congo crisis beginning in the summer of 1960, which it seemed to observers in the USIA and elsewhere in the Kennedy administration, late Eisenhower, early Kennedy, had the potential, along with apartheid, to pull the Global South away from non-alignment as a central organizing principle and toward something more racialized, a sort of Bandung 2.0, a spirit of solidarity that could transcend just Cold War concerns. As the USI reported shortly after Kennedy's inauguration, quote, "The Congo crisis, which dominated the African scene for the last half of 1960, has had a great impact on African opinion throughout the continent. Many Africans had become more Africa conscious about what Africans seem to regard as the lingering vestiges of the colonial era, Western economic, military, administrative, and cultural influences." News of the death of Patrice Lumumba, seen here in the upper right, redoubled the intensity of these media wars. The story lent a sharp edge to Moscow's prodigious efforts to, quote, "identify the Soviet Union as the patron saint of anti-colonialism, whose major theme was the charge of imperialist machinations and Western unwillingness to give up its colonial holdings." It found expression in various media and fora, including staged demonstrations against Belgium, its allies, and the UN. One such demonstration saw attacks on the Belgian embassy in Belgrade just months before the meeting there. Coverage of the protests and denunciation of the imperialist and UN intrigues led block film, press, and radio output, the latter of which doubled in the wake of Lumumba's death in January 1961. Mao's output, as before, was even more radical. The Kennedy administration feared that this campaign was working and scrambled for an effective response as the Congo crisis lingered. The Central American response was to emphasize once again American support for the United Nations and for humanitarian relief in the Congo. As one official put it, quote, "The best way to keep the Cold War out of Africa is to keep the United Nations in." But even attempting a subdued, sympathetic, and multilateral approach constituted an uphill climb for the United States. This was in part because of the power of Lumumba. A USIS study of the, quote, Lumumba symbol in Africa found that the hero martyr, its words, was invoked at every opportunity. Safely removed from the political scene after his death, he is now, here's the report, glorified by African radical nationalists as the symbol of African aspirations and as a weapon in the struggle to consolidate unity. This climate made it hard for the USIA's relatively subtle message of multilateralism and pro-UN and pro-anti-colonialism writ broadly and banally large to be heard. Washington simply lacked a comparable figure to Lumumba to be the face of its Africa policy, one that could match those loudest African voices, especially as those voices were amplified by Kwame Nkrumah's African Bureau working from Accra. The Bureau exalted Lumumba as the personification of the nationalist unifier, the courageous, uncorrupted, anti-colonial nation builder. Nkrumah, seen here, felt that Lumumba was, like himself, a living symbol of Pan-Africanism, a movement U.S. officials in 1959 judged to embody racial, cultural, and regional solidarity. Nkrumah made Accra into the headquarters of this movement. Contemporary observers saw potential in the movement borne along on a media stream launched from Accra and elsewhere in newly independent Africa. As Rupert Emerson put it in 1962, the realist is likely to dismiss Pan-Africanism as an idle and romantic dream. Events may well prove him to be correct, but in the interim, the devotion to Pan-Africanism is both widespread and charged with emotion. Nkrumah is far from alone in his repeated insistence that independence takes on its full meaning only if all of Africa is free and if African unity is achieved. So the Pans, Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism, and the spirit of Bandung loom very large in these years, and they connect to the American home front thanks to the violent drama of the American civil rights movement. They point to a moment of racial awakening whose full implications at the time were not clear, but which coursed through a multiplicity of third world voices and, again, connected to the American home front. Indirectly, thus, to the Third World Project, sort of broadly and still very vaguely conceived, but with, it seemed, the potential of the moment of destiny that its avatars championed it to have. I want to step away from this for the moment. We're going to move into our third case study, which doesn't tie as directly into this, but its timing means that at this moment, when the borders of this project are a little vague but seem to be pushing outward, it adds a continent thanks to an often overlooked agreement between global North and South on the defining qualities of what's going to be called the Third World. Our third case study, the Alliance for Progress in Kennedy administration relations with Latin America, is here not only because the Global South broadly and Latin America specifically rise to the top of the Kennedy administration's priority list, as they do, but also because this overlooked bit about the North-South agreement on the defining common characteristic of the Global South. Namely, by the time you're done with this story, figures as different as the United States, the Soviet Union, much of Africa, and Fidel Castro will all agree that poverty and underdevelopment are the central features of the Global South, even though most of the places you think of in association with those have just won their independence, and Latin America won its independence more than 100 years prior. A Kennedy administration official early in the Kennedy years was quoted in words that could have been spoken by Fidel Castro when he addressed the UN sometime later. Economic colonialism is as dead as political colonialism, and both are equally important. This is, in a way, the means by which Latin America becomes part of the Third World. It's worth tracing in Kennedy's own words, in his own mind, this progression. Kennedy's 1957 speech about the Algeria crisis very pointedly mentioned Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, the uncommitted world, in his phrase in 1957 at the time, but it included only one passing reference to the Western Hemisphere. By the time you get to the post-Castro hemisphere, that region is very much not only, in Kennedy's words, the most dangerous area in the world, a title that Stephen Rabe used for his book, but very much conceptually part of this larger global South. The geographical area of concern, that is, by these years is getting larger. It is defined not primarily by its recent colonial status or by its Afro-Asian-ness or by its adherence to non-alignment, but by its shared post-imperial poverty. In the words of the Sprague Committee, which was tasked with studying American American public diplomacy in the 50s, quote, "We are facing a revolt of the have-nots, particularly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America." JFK's 1961 speech, which we usually think of in reference to the moonshot, concurred, referencing the instability of, quote, "the whole southern half of the globe." Prompted by a wave of anti-Americanism, and especially by Castro, who wrote it, the Kennedys sought to preempt any more Castros via the Alliance for Progress's agenda of modernization and development, and it in turn would apply a Rostovian model in Latin America that then could be exported to the rest of the global South. For the purposes of my book, I want to turn to something that most scholars who study the alliance, the AFP, have not done, which is to engage its public diplomacy dimension, which is a kind of a sine qua non for the project. Not just because for the alliance to work, it requires massive buy-in by the Latin American public, but also because the Sprague Committee, the one I mentioned a minute ago, found that the U.S. was falling way behind in public diplomacy in Latin America, as the Soviets and the Chinese had made it a top priority. So we're not talking about the alliance as a program, but we are talking about the sort of spin associated with it, promotion associated with it, because that part of it was seen as essential to its success. And I contend that it's essential to its gradual sort of integration of the Latin American region into the global South, Third World. 2 months into the Kennedy administration, wary of overpromising either too much money or too soon results, the administration nonetheless launched the Alliance for Progress, March 1961, with a blitz aimed at, in the NSC's words, making the alliance as well known as Monroe Doctrine and the Good Neighbor Policy. So Kennedy announced it to a roomful of Latin American diplomats, meeting at the White House, a cooperative effort meant to pool hemispheric resources, including an unspecified amount from the United States, to encourage Latin American social reform and economic development, meant to raise living standards, counteract Castroism, and show the way forward for the non-European world. Building toward the organizational meeting for the alliance, Punta del Este, in the summer of 1961, the policy planning staff urged leveraging JFK's momentum to capture what it called the revolutionary and nationalistic forces to which communism is appealing by associating the U.S. with Latin American desires for higher living standards, more social justice, and a sense of independent national pride. According to the USIA's own research, stealing Castro's thunder in this way remained a viable prospect at this point. Didn't seem like a fool's errand to those in charge. In keeping with the cooperative thrust of the alliance, the OAS was slated to take over its public diplomacy over the next few years, but in the meantime, the USI continued to flood the Latin American landscape, the media landscape, to the south in support of it. There was some reason to believe that the outreach was succeeding. The response to the AFP, as the agents would go into the field and try to track as best they could public opinion, found a reasonable level of awareness and reasonably favorable opinions everywhere except Cuba, but any such awakening fell well short of universal. The disparity between the policy and the publicity meant to promote it, and the sort of message misfires that accompanied that, slowed the momentum of Kennedy's Latin American initiative. As a joint state USIA and AID assessment observed in 1962, there was a growing tendency to criticize the AFP for failure to produce tangible and conspicuous results quickly enough, and to label the alliance as a U.S. aid program for Latin America, which it emphatically was not supposed to be. It's supposed to be cooperative, it's supposed to be hemispheric, but the association that got tagged in people's minds was, in Latin American minds, it's a Marshall Plan for Latin America, that there aren't as many obligations as there is sort of waiting for the paychecks to come in. As Rusk put it, in seeking to resolve, and Secretary of State Dean Rusk, in seeking to resolve the policy publicity disparity, quote, how we and citizens of Latin America feel about the alliance may turn out to be the most difficult part of all. We are dedicating ourselves to a decade of impatience. Reports from on the ground in Latin America found that USI's success in projecting the message didn't necessarily mean success in its reception among Latin Americans. Quote, AFP accomplishments to date have not lived up to the rising expectations stimulated in the minds of many Brazilians, in this case, by widespread AFP publicity. The report noted the failure of the AFP to marry itself to Latin American nationalism, which was, quote, the single most powerful psychological force now operating there. In a sense, American public diplomats were now getting a clearer sense of the landscape they were dealing with, the challenge before them. They had been congratulating themselves on efficiently getting the word out, as they did by most objective measures, only to discover it wasn't being heard in the right way, by the right people, and in the right context. It was falling victim to a kind of, and this is a Congress of Latin American leaders that gathered to study this, came to this conclusion, there was a kind of a catch-22. For the alliance to succeed, it needed the political and, their words, spiritual support of Latin American peoples to complete its individual projects and accomplish its objectives. But until it completed its individual projects and accomplished some objectives, that support would not be forthcoming. It couldn't elicit it no matter how much media outreach there was. Now, historians like Jeff Taffet and Stephen Rabe have identified the shortcomings in the design and execution of the AFP, and more recent work by Tom Field have shown how it veers quickly into authoritarianism and a larger role from the military than is healthy for civil society. But the public diplomacy dimension was, as I mentioned before, in some respects the sine qua non. If you can't achieve ownership by the masses in the project, then it can't ever succeed anywhere near what its architects hope that it can. The initial expectations of an enthusiastic mass awareness and support for the alliance were perhaps unrealistic, and the letdown led to a contrasting pessimism. That same Congress of Latin American leaders studying the program lamented, and I quote, "The program is fascinating, and the surprising thing is that it fails to fascinate. The alliance has failed to capture the popular imagination." Now, the public diplomacy dimension of the alliance petered out in step with its broader trend, especially after Kennedy's death. But what's of interest to us, I contend, are two things. One, confirmation that underdevelopment and poverty, and thus economic development and modernization, are the central defining issues of inter-American and U.S. Third World relations more broadly. The notion that the real revolution is shared by Africa, Asia, and Latin America, despite their radically different political contexts at that moment. It's a kind of an unspoken and remarkable agreement between the United States, Castro, and Latin America that the world is above all divided along economic lines, not ideological ones, not racial ethnic ones, not regional religious or cultural ones, but economic ones first and foremost. So that's the first thing I think we take from this. The second is the increasing crowdedness of the public diplomacy field, the increasing agency among its multiplying voices and actors. Conditions in Latin America meant that this was always the case there, but now it could be detected as hitting a kind of a critical mass elsewhere. And I would conclude on this point because I think it's the real takeaway from the book more broadly. The explosion of third world public diplomacy, not just in the third world, but of the third world, and the unintended consequence of gelling that third world international community into an actual geopolitical actor are worthy of our attention. As European and American and East Bloc media output to Africa, just to take that continent as an example, around 1960 peaked, it saw as well the spread of homegrown Afro-Asian media as well. The director of the VOA noted this kind of growing cacophony on a tour through Africa in 1959. It's a long quote, but it's worth lingering on, and then we'll come to a conclusion and go to the Q&A. In the bush of Tanganyika, a young African told me in good English that he listened to the following radio stations: BBC, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, VOA, Moscow, Salisbury, Leopoldville, Brazzaville, Cairo, and Peking. He was unhappy because he could not get Ghana. He did not mention Delhi or Karachi. Programs are being Africanized by Africans for Africans about Africa. While each country is concerned about the broadcasts of others, most are very eager to share their experience with their neighbors and become the leader of emerging Africa. In Dakar, I was told that external broadcasts took precedence over internal ones. And these conclusions were seconded by other folks traveling through the field, through the bush in Africa, who came back and reported things like villagers in the smallest, most isolated, out-of-the-way places knowing the price of a battery and the price of a radio at the closest market they could get to. The convergence of this critical mass as well supported a convergence in the conclusions about the world situation and brought to the forefront themes like non-alignment, like the spirit of Bandung, like the importance of development and economic modernization. The broader conclusion, then, is that by carrying the Cold War into the non-European world, public diplomats from the global north helped to catalyze an identity among impoverished, imperialized areas. building on a nucleus of non-alignment, underdevelopment, race consciousness, race solidarity, and anti-colonialism, leaders of these new nations in these areas formulated the Third World Project. They expressed it to the wider world and to each other in public diplomacy and media outreach of their own. In much the same way that the Gettysburg Address altered the meaning of the Civil War, I contend that the rhetoric of the newly independent, race-conscious, non-aligned, and impoverished Third World changed the terms of the Cold War. Thank you. Yes, happy to take questions, sir.
Yeah, your statement early on in the talk that it's really difficult to evaluate whether public diplomacy works or not was interesting in light of the quote that you gave at the very end. Couldn't you say that public diplomacy works if you get people to listen to your message? And that's about it. You can't sort of go in with a public opinion poll and say, well, do you think different today than you did yesterday? Or something like that. Is that the way to measure it?
Well, I'm very glad you asked this because I jumped off of this before I got to the sort of final conclusion. I teased at the beginning that I think this project holds an answer to the sort of the permanent question. Because the very fact that everyone in this story acts like public diplomacy works, everyone who can picks up a microphone and joins the conversation, that kind of creates its own reality after a while. Even if you're not actually converting people's beliefs, the fact that every actor, big and small, as soon as they can join the conversation, does so, suggests to me they thought it was worth doing. And they never even questioned whether or not it's really important to go study the effects. There's nothing like the USIA's audience research conducted by Nehru's public diplomats and Nkrumah's public diplomats or any of the others who are NASA. They don't have agents sort of sending out surveys and questionnaires to try to find out if the message is resonating. They'll have people on site, but they'll just be reporting back, well, we heard this broadcast and the cafe that I was in seemed to respond positively. So very anecdotal, very sort of, pointillist almost in their audience research. And yet there's never a serious debate about just stopping, right? But for these difficult countries, we barely have enough money to keep the lights on a lot, right? But this is something that all of them seem to not need any persuading that it's worth doing. And so it doesn't answer the question, because I don't think it can answer the question of whether or not this message was 37% effective and that people feel nicer, feel more warmly about NASA or about the U.S. or whatever else. But everyone is in this conversation to the extent that they can be in it, and they never second guess their own decision. So after a while, if the states are acting like they think it's effective, then at a minimum, they all think everyone else is as effective, and they want to be in that competition, right? So it's a bit of a cop-out, but I think that pursuing the answer to is it working, I think we can consider it something of a chimera, because all of our actors believe that it worked well enough to do it. So I don't know. Does that sound like a cop-out?
No.
I'm open to being persuaded otherwise. I've been married to the topic for a very long time now, so it's really difficult to see outside it.
Kennedy also started a little bit later the Peace Corps. Do you think that had any tie-ins with this, third world diplomacy and trying to get feedback from third world countries?
Unquestionably, and they were, the Peace Corps was, one of the most sort of common sort of topics in American outreach to the Global South. So a deployment of teachers would show up in Bolivia or something, and before they had even taught their first class, there'd be pictures of them meeting the villagers, meeting folks in the place they're going to live. I'm not saying that that's why the Peace Corps was launched. Lisa Cox, the creator of this, and she finds not only other sources of it, Lisa Cox other sources of it, but also sort of other influences on it from abroad, including the spring fully formed from Kennedy's head. But its PR value was immense because it was seen as an American sort of statement putting American values into play and be willing to sort of actually walk the proverbial walk, going to these places to help them along this sort of Rostovian path toward a modern economy. So yes, I think the USIA's output in these years, kind of what's the movies and so forth, DOA, got a lot of mileage out of the Peace Corps.
is obviously there are already sort of post-colonial connections going on between Caribbean intellectuals and African intellectuals, for example,
Right.
and general kind of Marxist second world sorts of connections going on, racial discourses going on. But is this Latin American consciousness, this new discourse of economic colonialism, is this something that is sort of sending them to look sideways to Asia and Africa? What's that part of the story?
Well, that is my contention, and it's based on the fact that if I were to, pick out a half dozen quotes from Castro and Guevara's speeches in high-profile venues like the UN or like the Untitled Conference, and then put them into a hat with quotes by Kennedy officials, you'd be hard-pressed in many cases to figure out whose analysis of the problem we were talking about. Because even though the prescriptions for curing the problem of poverty are very different, the analysis of poverty as the central defining issue, underdevelopment as the main thing that separates North from South and binds the South together. It represents a remarkable consensus. And so conceptually, in 1951, 52, if you'd asked Latin Americans and if you'd asked Algerians or Egyptians or Ghanaians, are you part of the same team, I guess, as Latin America? You share problems with Latin America. All parties would have said, no, we have some things in common, but we have more differences than commonalities. By the time you get to these years, that opinion shifts. And by the time you get to the end of the 1960s, you can find Latin American officials, even those who are not in sort of the wave of leftist governments like they ended at that time, you can find sort of mainstream Latin American opinion embracing a third world identity. We suffered from poverty that was the cause of empire, first formal empire by the Spanish Portuguese, then informal empire by the American British, and this connects us sideways. This connects us across to Africa, Middle East, and Asia. Again, the prescriptions are different, but the analyses are strikingly similar.
And are you seeing the Africans and Asians then taking this discourse up from the Latin Americans and beginning to speak more about poverty and less about race? Or
Right. And Castro deserves sort of top billing in this change because he is very early and often, making the case that Cuba is a colony. He's like saying, I saw what happened in Congo. That could have happened here. It basically could happen here. It just didn't work, right? We are in the same boat as them. And he sort of mainstreams this conceptualization of it in ways that if you'd been placing bets earlier, you might not have seen coming. It's quite remarkable. By the end of it, and Castro hosts in '66 the famous Tricontinental Conference, which has Castro's podium, and it's the Tricontinental Conference of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And if you proposed that in 1956, hell, Castro tried to propose that in 1961, you actually get that purchase. But by the time you get a little further in the decade, the mental map is shifting.
Right, I'm kind of trying to figure out the causal lines you're trying to draw. It sounds as if you want to contend that sometimes public diplomacy on the United States plays some sort of role, not exactly catalytic, but nevertheless reinforcing to the emergence of the third world. Is that right?
It is, and I would actually...
That's right?
Yeah, and I would go further, and I would say catalytic.
You would say catalytic?
Yeah, I think that's a fair...
Yeah, I'm trying to just... Here's an alternative story, and I wonder how you react to it. Then in the 50s, especially under Eisenhower, the United States becomes quite interventionist, engaging in regime intervention and regime change,
Right.
especially in the Middle East, in 53, 57, and so forth.
Right.
And it is pretty aggressive in its anti-neutral, and you're with us against this kind of black-white conception of the world. And I think the non-aligned movement and what you're describing here can be seen as a reaction to that strategic behavior. Never mind what the word needs. We're behaving in a way that's consolidating a perception of the world as either us or them, and leaving them little choice. Never mind our public diplomacy. That's strategic. Maybe that's the catalytic action. And that it begins to become more questionable right in your time period. Because I have the impression that Mobutu, for example, in Congo, he kills Lumumba. Right? He arrests him and kills him 3 days before Kennedy's inaugurated. case is an episode of them starting to worry that Kennedy might be changing the strategic priorities of that Eisenhower era, and they're going to get rid of them almost. And they're consolidated around, really, they had no reason to kill him right then. They just held him in arrest forever. So, and it seems to me like they're reacting then to sort of the unfolding strategic moves in the United States and the changing of leadership in the United States from a highly interventionist Cold War approach to Kennedy, which might be somewhat different, at least rhetorically different initially. This is still, they would take sort of hurts him.
But certainly rhetorically, Kennedy was much more open to neutrals and allies. You didn't see it black and white.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point.
There's this change of the quote I have about it being a fact of international life. Essentially, we, the United States, are gradually subject to this day. And your point is well made. It connects to Arnie Westhoff's book of the war. The interventions by the militaries triggered this formation of the community. Right? I don't dispute that. I wouldn't say otherwise. I would only say, if I could sort of fill in some of the rest of the picture, that most of the third world doesn't experience the Cold War as intervention. It experiences as a media war for the richer parts and minds. Your average third world resident is far more likely to counter Hamlet in the CIA than to counter a Marine, right, or something in the CIA. And to the extent the interventions still have this outsized effect on sort of the formation of the third world identity, the rest of the third world hears about it through the war of their hearts and minds. Because the Americans will say something about it, the Soviets will say something about it, the Chinese will say something, and then Nasser and Nkrumah and Nehru will all also say things about it. So news of those events in places like Indonesia or Iran or wherever travels to the rest of the third world and elicits a response from the rest of the third world that I contend changes the way that people there think about their own role in the Cold War. And above all, wants them to make sure it stays out of their environment. So it sort of stokes the resistance to the kind of interventions proposed. But I see your point.
The interventions, I think, in the mind of many people in the third world, it's not U.S. Marines arriving. It's the CIA arriving and empowering Mobutu,
Right.
or others within Congo, the hidden hand, as they might see it. They're seeing clearly indigenous leaders, but as tools,
Right.
or certainly clients of the Western CIA.
That's very true, and Nkrumah's African Bureau wasted no time in figuring what he said were CIA plots against Timor, against Pan-Africans, or against the rest of Africa generally. But the Congo crisis in the beginning of 1960, the fabled year of Africa, Congo in that year is one of 17 African nation states to achieve independence, right? And it's the one where things go back badly south. So in the Congo, and in the view of people like Nkrumah, this is representative of the way that the North is going to treat the South. This is why Pan-African unity, third world unity is going to be necessary to sort of keep the Cold War from coming back in. But for the rest of the continent, it's a story that plays out as headlines. Right? It plays out as radio broadcasts. And it furthermore does so at a time when they can respond back and either agree with the current reading of the situation or leverage their own position over against their neighbors in hopes of gaining these countries more influence. I should say, I don't want to dismiss the importance of the interventions, but I also don't want to give them too much credit compared to the much steadier sort of media drumbeat across these decades of the North trying to defend the Cold War itself as a matter of one's heart, mind, and soul, not so much as a matter of what puppet is the soul of which regime. So I hope that's not too unsatisfying answer. I know it's tricky because Westside makes a wonderful case for the formative effect of these interventions. I guess what I'm tracking are the places that didn't get intervened in, but did hear about them and could respond to them.
And that sounds like the agency is in the media of these other places, not really the U.S. public diplomacy.
But it is
Because actually,
actually-
their minds are almost moving in exactly the opposite direction of U.S. public diplomacy is trying to take.
Yes, yeah, very much. It's this massive unintended consequence. I mean, the sense of destiny imbued with it. He was imbued with a kind of sense of destiny. You can find that same line in the words of his gender. It's like Squire, like Navy, like Master. I'm glad
So if you look forward 60 years to today, has anything really changed? I mean, you look at what's happening in eastern Ukraine, you look what's happening in the Middle East, and not really a colonialism, but almost like a post-dictatorship, post-Arab Spring, and there's very much a battle for words and mind, or for hearts and minds right now. Why does it seem like we really haven't learned any lessons from the past? In your
well, for what it's worth, my own take is that because this is deceptively hard to do, and practitioners through its career figured out after they were trying to sort of spread the word just how hard it was to spread it and make it stick. Because people are their own agents, their own actors, and they're going to have different responses to it. And even setting aside the sort of baggage that a message from Washington would carry, based on what everyone already knows about this history and about Washington's ulterior motives and issues of that. It's much more volatile and contested than one would think, and one never really arrives at a foolproof metric for figuring out what's getting through and what's not. So the USIA was folded, it closed its doors in 1999. It was very much a creature of the Cold War. Its functions were revived under the Department of State's after 9/11. Public diplomacy was once again sort of raised up to have somewhat of a profile that it has since the end of the Cold War. But its rate of success was never much better. In fact, the book actually began as a project, post 9/11 project on my part, to try and figure out what the U.S. had said during the Cold War, to try and win those hearts and minds, because there may be lessons there for a post 9/11 world. It turns out that, in my mind, the biggest lesson is the unintended consequences of what happens when it's not just you holding the microphone and speaking, it's everyone grabs microphones and creating a certain chaos conversation. So we're bad at it because it's hard. That's my short answer to that. It's lessons.
Taking us back a little bit to the first question, and the question of sources and how you measure their impact. When I think about cultural diplomacy and public diplomacy, I'm primarily, from my background, I'm thinking U.S. and Korean, thinking 1960s. And there we have a case study where the United States is pretty successful in encouraging kind of pro-Western values among an educated and elite class that's primarily urban and literate. But we have almost the exact opposite in the distant South, where we have an almost anti-Western backlash and a resurgence of Korean nationalism that gives us things like Confucian villages and other things to try to train people to think otherwise, to resist this sort of culture of public diplomacy. So that gets me to two questions, I guess. One is that when you answered George's question by saying that we think it's effective because everyone is doing it, because all of these leaders are rushing to partake in the conversation, is it possible they're all partaking in the conversation because they speak the same language, but it's not a language that 60, 70, 80% of their own population speak. And so maybe they are overestimating what is happening on the ground. And then as a tangent to that, the question becomes, do you see any of this similar kickback among these third world nations? Do they hear the language of what's happening in Cuba or in Ghana or the Congo, and they respond by wanting to emphasize more the influence of their own native traditions and language?
First question, yes, it's entirely possible that the folks who are picking up the microphones, themselves the elites of these countries, are fooling themselves in the same way that the USIA is about effectiveness. The sort of eureka moment for me was the thought that they never spent any time worrying about measuring effectiveness, they just kept doing it anyway. So this is a force multiplier for new states. This is something we can do reasonably cheaply, which is good because we don't have a lot of resources. We can Ghana, we can Egypt. And we can see its effects within our country and within our region. Someone like Nasser was a master of sort of crowd manipulation, theatrics, and performance. He was famous for using vernacular Arabic on the radio to sort of reach outside his own country's borders. So his effectiveness he measured by how the crowd reacted. And for most of the 60s, they reacted pretty well to him. So he could sort of point to that as effectiveness in his own corner. And certainly a reason to keep doing it. And phenomenon and think someday we'll be able to move the Arab street just as well as Nasser. We just get our radio broadcast right. We get the right accent on our Arabic. We find a way to sort of tailor this to the audience. We too can have this kind of influence. That's probably a fool's errand, but the idea that this can have an impact at some point, even if it's not having a measurable one, if everyone keeps doing it, you've got to do it just to keep up with the Joneses, right? And even if you can't prove that it's reaching the 67%.
Or you don't, though. I would argue that the smart perspective isn't to keep up with the Joneses if what you think is that the Joneses aren't effective. Now, in your conclusion, the part that really made me think I may be wrong in what I'm saying is you read that long quote, and it had these African villagers knowing the price of the radio and the battery.
Right.
And in my look at Korea, it isn't so much like that, and maybe it's a question of time or economic development or whatever. So maybe that message is getting through in your case studies that don't in mine. But it still seems to me that the smart thing to do is to recognize that don't keep up with the Joneses if what the Joneses are doing is a waste of time and money.
Right. And there are certainly voices along the way, Congress especially, who are like, this is pointless, we're spending money on the USI that we shouldn't be because we can't prove anything is working. And to my knowledge, the response to that would sometimes involve, well, we have to try this because it's what the other guys are doing. That wasn't always persuasive, but yeah, you certainly could have stepped back from it. And the flip side is it isn't actually that expensive. As these things go, it's sort of like, well, we may as well gamble on it. And my conclusion is one of the alternate titles of the book was Murrow's Wager, right? With reference to Pascal's wager, right? I don't know if God exists, but I may as well act like he does. So Murrow can't prove that the USI is having an effect, but you may as well act like it is, right? Because everyone else is doing it too. Your second question.
Backlash.
Backlash. It's a trickier one. I guess I don't want to paint a picture of sort of total failure. What I want to paint is a picture of sort of ambiguous results, right? And so among the USI's projects would be not just sort of radio broadcasts and poster campaigns and things like that, but for example, English language classes for the elites of these new societies in the hopes that they would literally speak the same language representing competition of power. So at one point, after that fabled sort of year of Africa, something like half the members of parliament in French Africa, a newly independent French Africa, so Togo and Senegal and so on, were taking English language classes at the local USIS library. And I guess if you were going to look for backlash, you would want to find the sort of moments when they said, no, by God, we speak French, or no, by God, we're not going to be dragged into this war.
Yeah, but again, absolutely, you're right. But my question again is more about those sort of distant rural villages, not the children of legislators.
Yeah, and the backlash there, I think, is hard to measure as frontlash was, right? I mean, you can't sort of see the responses very, very concretely until the proverbial peasants are revolting. Sort of assume that it's connected back to that. So I hope that's.
Just picking up the same in many of these places, by the time you were looking at, the United States is pretty much committed to an elite in those countries. And you have those countries are somewhat undifferentiated. I mentioned Mobutu earlier, but the Shahs in Iran, Mobutu in Congo, the generals are in power in Indonesia, the Philippines, South Vietnam, South Korea, all over Latin America, the kings in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Libya. Those are all our allies. That's much of the so-called third world that we're describing. And they're not resonating to this. Some of them were leaders like Nasser, but he's not one of our guys, right? You've left all those other people who could have been third world, who were the leaders, who were the actual governing officials in these places. You focused on the ones who were sort of out of the orbit, right? Nasser, Tito, and so forth. And I was wondering if another way of thinking about what the United States was doing is, and maybe this is reading our counterinsurgency of today back to then, is we were trying to help make those who were pro-America, so to speak, more legitimate, or appear more legitimate in the era of rising nationalism.
Well,
So, it may have been counterproductive, but I guess my point, none of these people who we were tied to are the people you're thinking about when you come to the third world, which means, in my mind, the third world was not a single place. In other words, it was a deeply divided place.
Sure. played sort of supporting actor roles for U.S. executives in different places and times. So Van Dunn, for example, right, comes in 1955, the U.S. wasn't invited. It still wanted to sort of make sure that it could have its position for the advance, or at least vaguely defended. And so it recruited, and having trouble persuading Carlos Romulo of the Philippines to be the American spokesman, and not the title as such, but to advance sort of American narrative at the conference. And so it's thanks to the efforts of Romulo, with an assist from Pakistan, that the final communique at the conference included a combination of colonialism in all its forms, red colonialism as well as Euro colonialism, imperial colonialism, the old sort of battle style. This was seen within the Eisenhower administration as something of a triumph, because this is exactly how the U.S. would help to shape that narrative, and could do so with the willing participation of Romulo, who we think of at that conference as actually giving a fairly fiery speech against colonialism, including Western colonialism. He's most famous for that in that moment. And so at Van Dunn, Romulo inhabits sort of both sides. On the one hand, he can be the firebrand. On the other hand, he can be the sort of proxy of the U.S. So I'm not sure this fully addresses your question, but the editorial control and even veto power that American allies have over spreading these kind of messages in their countries had a lot to do with the impact that public police could have had, whether by us or by other actors. So Nasser would make sure he broadcast in Farsi to Iran. Shah sometimes would jam him, sometimes when the USIA tried to operate in Iran, they had to get Shah's okay, whatever messages or campaigns they were going to do. As a consequence, much of the USIA output in a lot of these places was more along the lines of instructional manuals than it was sort of exhortations to join the good side of the court. So there's manuals on how to dig a well, manuals on how to farm better so mosquitoes don't thrive. You had sort of how-to stuff instead of hearts and minds stuff in a lot of these places. But the USI is operating, but they don't have free reign, and they're more interested in bolstering the power of those American allies in the third world than they are in challenging it. As long as the sort of overarching agenda to keep economies out of these places is foregrounded, then that's good enough for the USI.
How successful is the United States in shaping the modernization narrative? You kind of talked about Rostowian modernization. How successful is it in getting that into the third world imagined community that you spoke about?
Depends on who you ask. There's a new book by Daniel Emmerbar, that's very good, called Thinking Small, which tracks the kind of back and forth exchanges about ideas of community development between the sort of post-New Deal United States and the sort of village model in the Philippines and elsewhere. That a veneration of community and sort of the idea that modernization has to happen in particular ways was the result, for in his telling, of the exchange between the United States and abroad, not just sort of the United States saying, we need to modernize the world because the 5 states got much better. So it varies. In different settings, different parts of that message would resonate. But to tie it back to the question about the elites and sort of niche targeting that a lot of the U.S. actors did, a lot of the elites themselves are educated in Western institutions. They go to Oxford, or they come to the United States for college, and they go back home. This gives you a chance to sort of impart that set of agendas, but it doesn't have equal purchase everywhere. London School of Economics is sort of famously credit or blame, depending on stance, with the direction that a lot of post-independence third world economies take, because it had, if not a full-on sort of this wasn't a hard case to make in most places. The case for sort of American style or Soviet style models and modernization. The places where it ran up against the most resistance were places where the alternate sort of ultimately Marx-derived model would be the ones that held their
Any other questions?
I just have one question about the Alliance for Progress.
Yes.
Is that more than just propaganda that's actually getting people in and sending money in? Could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, in a nutshell, the Alliance for Progress is supposed to be this collaborative effort to build Latin American infrastructure in ways that will feed Latin America's economic modernization. So think of it like almost as a sort of another sort of spin-off of the New Deal. We'll build roads, we'll build housing projects, we'll build dams, we will use public monies, American and Latin American, to create the kind of platform on which modern economies rest. As a kind of a bonus, we will see what we can do to entice private investment, and as an extra bonus, and this is really the point of contention, we will insist upon social reforms, especially land reforms in Latin America. And the point of contention is that the Latin American elites have no interest in that at all, basically, because it's one thing to accept money from the Yankees and to sort of use those kind of programs to help build houses for the poor. It's something else entirely to shake up what has been the basis of these Latin American societies for 100 years by breaking up the large landholding, giving presents freehold status, and other things that in our American sort of template are necessary for modernizing the agricultural economy, but in their mind are pretty close to a social revolution. So the pushback is it's not so much fervent, it's more like slow walking, and sort of like waiting the storm out, and that's what they're ultimately do, especially after Kennedy's death, because Johnson's far less aggressive in the Alliance for Progress model by the end of the decade exists today.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.